After I refused to give my husband my inheritance, he invited me to a family meeting. When I arrived, they had lawyers ready to force me to sign it over. But the moment they handed me the papers, I smiled and said, "Funny, I brought someone too." The phone call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, jarring me from sleep with its shrill urgency. Mr. Harrison's voice crackled through the receiver, formal yet tinged with something I couldn't quite place, sympathy mixed with disbelief. "Mrs. Claire Whitmore Reed, I'm calling regarding your grandfather's will reading. There's been, well, let's just say there are some unexpected developments. Can you be at my office by 10 this morning?" I sat up in bed, my heart still heavy from Grandpa Edward's funeral just 3 days prior. The smell of lilies from the service seemed to linger in my hair, a constant reminder of the man who'd raised me after my parents died in that car accident when I was 12. Colin stirred beside me, his arm reaching across the empty space where I'd been lying. "What's wrong?" he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "The lawyer wants to see me about Grandpa's will," I whispered, already swinging my legs out of bed. Something about Mr. Harrison's tone made my stomach twist with anticipation and dread. "Before we continue, I want to thank you for joining me in sharing these stories that matter. If you believe that women deserve financial independence and protection from manipulation, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more women who need to hear this. Now let's see how this unfolds." 2 hours later, I found myself sitting in the mahogany-paneled office that smelled of old books and leather, facing a document that would change everything. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat nervously, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he read the words that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. "To my beloved granddaughter, Claire Elizabeth Whitmore, I leave my entire estate, including all properties, investments and liquid assets, totaling approximately $2.4 million. The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd expected maybe a small keepsake, perhaps the old pocket watch he'd always carried. But everything? The sprawling Victorian house on Maple Street where I'd spent my teenage years, the hardware store that had been in our family for 3 generations, the investment portfolio he'd built over decades of careful planning, all of it was mine. "I don't understand," I stammered, my hands trembling as I reached for the thick envelope marked with my name in Grandpa's distinctive handwriting. "What about my cousins? Uncle Richard's children? Surely he meant to divide it among the family." Mr. Harrison shook his head gravely. "Your grandfather was very specific, Claire. He updated this will 6 months ago, and I can assure you he was of completely sound mind. There's also a personal letter for you." With shaking fingers, I tore open the envelope. Grandpa's familiar script filled the cream-colored stationery, each word carefully chosen in the way that had always made his bedtime stories so magical. "My dearest Claire, if you're reading this, then I've finally gone to join your grandmother in whatever comes next. Don't cry for me, sweetheart. I've lived a full life and knowing you has been its greatest joy. I'm leaving everything to you because you're the only one who ever saw past the money. When you were 16 and I offered to buy you a car, you asked if we could fix up the old Ford in the garage instead because it had character and stories to tell. When your cousins would visit and immediately start calculating what they might inherit, you'd sit with me on the porch swing and ask about my childhood, about your grandmother's garden, about the dreams I'd given up to build this fortune. You have a good heart, Claire, but I worry about that husband of yours. I've watched how his eyes light up when he thinks about money, how he steers conversations toward my business ventures and investment strategies. Be careful who you trust with this gift, my dear. Not everyone who claims to love you loves you for the right reasons. Make this inheritance count. Build something beautiful with it. And remember, you don't owe anyone anything no matter what they might say. All my love, Grandpa Edward." I pressed the letter to my chest, tears streaming down my cheeks as the full weight of his words settled over me. He'd seen something I'd been too trusting to recognize. The memory of Colin's behavior at family gatherings suddenly took on a different hue. The way he'd laugh just a little too loudly at Grandpa's jokes, how he'd volunteer to help with yard work whenever there might be talk of wills or estate planning. The drive home felt surreal, like moving through a dream where everything looked the same but felt fundamentally different. I kept glancing at the certified check in my purse, the numbers almost too large to comprehend. $2.4 million. It was more money than I'd ever imagined having, more than Colin and I earned combined in 5 years of marriage. Colin was waiting in the kitchen when I walked through the door, his laptop open on the granite countertop we'd spent months saving to afford. He looked up expectantly, that boyish smile I'd fallen in love with 7 years ago spreading across his face. "So, what did the old man leave you?" "I'm betting it's that antique jewelry collection. Your grandmother's pearls were always gorgeous on you." I set my purse down carefully, studying his expression. There was something eager in his eyes, a brightness that reminded me uncomfortably of Grandpa's warnings. "Actually, he left me everything, Colin. The entire estate." The coffee mug slipped from his fingers, shattering against the tile floor in an explosion of ceramic and dark liquid. For a moment he just stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like he couldn't quite process the words. "Everything?" he whispered, and I heard something in his voice I'd never noticed before, calculation mixed with excitement. "You mean the house? The business? The investments?" "All of it." I bent to pick up the larger pieces of the broken mug, needing something to do with my hands. "Mr. Harrison said it's worth about $2.4 million total." Colin's laugh echoed through the kitchen, bright and slightly manic. "Claire, do you realize what this means? We're set for life. We can pay off the mortgage, buy that cabin we've always talked about, maybe start that consulting business I've been dreaming about. This changes everything." But as I looked up at him from where I knelt on the floor, surrounded by fragments of broken ceramic, all I could think about was Grandpa's letter burning like a brand in my purse. The way Colin's mind had immediately jumped to we and our plans sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the spilled coffee soaking through my jeans. Something fundamental had shifted in that moment, though I wouldn't understand the full scope of it until much later. The inheritance hadn't just changed my financial situation. It had revealed truths about my marriage that I'd been too trusting, too in love, or perhaps too afraid to see. As Colin continued talking excitedly about investment opportunities and joint ventures, his voice fading into background noise, I realized that Grandpa's greatest gift wasn't the money at all. It was the clarity to finally see the man I'd married for who he really was. The text message came on a Thursday afternoon while I was reorganizing Grandpa's study, trying to make sense of decades of financial documents and personal letters. Colin's name flashed on my phone screen. "Mom's making Sunday dinner. Family gathering at 2 p.m. Don't be late." Something about the tone felt wrong. Colin never used periods in his texts, and he certainly never referred to his mother's casual dinners as family gatherings. But after a week of increasingly tense conversations about the inheritance, conversations that always ended with me saying I needed more time to think, I figured maybe he was trying to smooth things over with a normal family afternoon. I should have trusted my instincts. Sunday arrived with an unseasonably gray sky, the kind of weather that makes everything feel heavy and ominous. I'd spent the morning at Grandpa's grave, telling him about the strange tension that had settled over my marriage like a fog I couldn't quite navigate through. The roses I'd placed on his headstone seemed to nod in the gentle breeze, as if he were listening, warning me to be careful. Colin had left early that morning, claiming he needed to help his mother prepare, but when I pulled into the familiar driveway of the modest ranch house where he'd grown up, I noticed several cars I didn't recognize. A sleek black sedan sat next to Evan's pickup truck, and behind it, a silver BMW that definitely didn't belong to anyone in Colin's family. The front door opened before I could knock, and Colin's smile seemed stretched too tight across his face. "Claire. Perfect timing. Everyone's here." Everyone. I stepped inside, immediately noticing that the usual warmth of his mother's home felt different. The living room had been rearranged, chairs pulled into a circle around the coffee table like some kind of intervention setup. "Colin, what's going on?" His mother, Sandra, emerged from the kitchen with a strained expression, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Oh, honey, the boys thought it would be good to have some help with all that paperwork you inherited. You know how confusing legal documents can be." That's when I saw them. Two men in expensive suits sitting on the couch like they owned the place, briefcases open and documents spread across the coffee table in neat, organized piles. Colin's brother Evan stood near the window, avoiding eye contact, his usual easy grin replaced by something that looked almost apologetic. "Claire, meet Robert Hendricks and James Morrison," Colin said, his voice taking on a tone I'd never heard before, authoritative, almost commanding. "They specialize in estate management and inheritance optimization. I thought they could help us figure out the best way to handle Grandpa Edward's estate." The word "us" hit me like a slap. I looked around the room, taking in the scene with growing clarity. This wasn't a family dinner. This was an ambush. I don't remember asking for help, I said carefully, my voice steadier than I felt. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but years of watching Grandpa negotiate business deals had taught me never to show weakness when cornered. Robert Hendricks stood, extending his hand with practiced charm. Mrs. Reed, your husband has explained the complexity of the inheritance. We're here simply to streamline the process, make things easier for both of you. Estate management can be overwhelming for someone without experience. The condescension in his voice made my skin crawl. I shook his hand briefly, noting how his grip lingered just a moment too long, how his smile never reached his eyes. These weren't family friends offering assistance. These were sharks Colin had brought to circle me. We've prepared some documents that will establish a joint trust, James Morrison added, gesturing to the papers spread across the table. It's really the most sensible approach for married couples. Full transparency, shared decision-making, optimal tax benefits. I moved closer to the coffee table, scanning the documents. Even without my reading glasses, I could see enough legal jargon to understand what they were really asking for. Transfer of assets. Joint control. Immediate liquidity options. They wanted me to sign over control of Grandpa's inheritance to a trust that Colin would co-manage. This is very thoughtful, I said slowly, picking up one of the documents. But I haven't had time to review everything with my own attorney yet. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Colin's jaw tightened and I caught Evan shifting uncomfortably near the window. Sandra had disappeared back into the kitchen, clearly wanting no part of whatever was about to unfold. Claire, we don't need to complicate this, Colin said, his voice carrying an edge I'd only heard once before, during our worst fight 3 years ago when I'd questioned a large withdrawal from our savings account. These gentlemen have handled hundreds of estates. They know what they're doing. I'm sure they do, I replied, setting the document back down. But Grandpa left the inheritance to me specifically. I think I owe it to his memory to make sure I understand every detail before making any decisions. Robert Hendricks exchanged a glance with Colin that made my stomach turn. There was something calculating in that look, something that suggested this conversation had been rehearsed. Mrs. Reed, Hendricks said, his tone becoming more insistent, time is a factor here. Market conditions, tax implications, delay can be costly. Your husband is simply looking out for your best interests. Our best interests, Colin corrected, and there it was, the truth laid bare. This wasn't about helping me manage an inheritance. This was about Colin getting his hands on money that had never been intended for him. I looked around the room again, seeing everything with crystalline clarity. The arranged furniture. The professional documents. The way everyone was positioned like they were closing in on prey. Even Evan, who'd always been kind to me, couldn't meet my eyes. But Colin had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated me. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, pretending to check the time. You know what? You're absolutely right about getting professional help with this. Colin's face brightened, thinking he'd won. I knew you'd see reason. I smiled, feeling a surge of satisfaction as I moved toward the front door. That's why I asked my attorney to stop by. She should be here any minute. The blood drained from Colin's face. Your attorney? Deborah Lane, I said, opening the door as if on cue. She specializes in inheritance protection and fraud prevention. Funny thing, she had some very interesting insights about husbands who try to manipulate their wives into signing over inherited assets. Deborah stepped through the doorway, her silver hair perfectly styled, her presence commanding immediate respect. At 62, she'd built a reputation as one of the most formidable estate attorneys in the state, and her sharp blue eyes missed nothing as they swept the room. Good afternoon, everyone, she said pleasantly, though her tone carried an unmistakable authority. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. The silence that followed was deafening. Colin's confidence cracked like ice under pressure, and suddenly he looked exactly like what he was. A man caught in the middle of betraying his wife's trust in broad daylight. As Deborah's presence filled Sandra's living room like a force field of legal authority, my mind began racing backward through 7 years of marriage, connecting dots I'd been too trusting, or perhaps too afraid, to see. The confrontation unfolding before me wasn't just about the inheritance. It was the culmination of a pattern I'd been living with for so long that it had become my normal. Standing there watching Colin's face cycle through shock, anger, and desperation, I suddenly remembered our 3rd anniversary dinner at Romano's. I'd been excited to surprise him with news that I'd gotten a promotion at the marketing firm, complete with a 15% salary increase. But instead of celebrating, Colin had immediately started calculating what we could do with the extra money. "This is perfect timing, babe," he'd said, cutting into his steak without even congratulating me first. "I've been looking at this investment opportunity, cryptocurrency mining. We could use your raise as seed money." When I'd hesitated, suggesting we should discuss major financial decisions together, his smile had faltered for just a moment. "Claire, you know I'm better with numbers than you are. Trust me on this one." That phrase, "trust me," had become his go-to response whenever I questioned anything financial. And somehow he'd made me believe that questioning him meant I didn't believe in us. The memory of that conversation felt different now, tainted by the understanding that Colin had never seen my success as something to celebrate, but rather as another resource to manage. Just like he was trying to manage Grandpa's inheritance. "Mrs. Reed," Deborah's voice brought me back to the present moment. "Perhaps we should review these documents these gentlemen have prepared?" I watched as she moved to the coffee table with the precision of a surgeon, her experienced eyes scanning the papers that Colin's hired attorneys had laid out like a trap. But while she read, my mind continued its painful journey through the archaeology of my marriage. There was the Mexico vacation that had appeared on our credit card statement, a $4,000 charge I'd discovered while paying bills. When I'd confronted Colin about it, he'd laughed it off, saying it was a surprise he'd been planning for months. "You're always stressed about work," he'd said, pulling me into his arms with that boyish grin that used to make my knees weak. "I thought we could use some time together. Don't you want to spend time with your husband?" The guilt in that question had been masterful. How could I be upset about a romantic gesture? How could I complain about my husband wanting to sweep me away on a dream vacation? But I'd never agreed to spend that money. We'd been saving for a down payment on a house, and that $4,000 had wiped out months of careful budgeting. Even worse was the BMW incident from 2 years ago. I'd come home from work to find a gleaming silver sedan in our driveway, Colin leaning against it with keys dangling from his finger like he'd won the lottery. "Surprise!" he'd called out, his excitement infectious. "I got us a car." Us. I'd walked around the vehicle, noting the pristine interior, the technology package, the premium sound system. "Colin, we already have a car. And we definitely don't have BMW money. It's a lease," he'd explained as if that made everything reasonable. "And it's in your name because your credit score is higher. The payments are totally manageable." Manageable for whom? I'd wondered but hadn't said aloud. Instead, I'd found myself making excuses for why we needed a luxury car, why it made sense to stretch our budget, why Colin's happiness was worth the financial stress that kept me awake at night. But the crypto incident had been the worst betrayal of all, though I hadn't recognized it as such at the time. Grandpa had given us $8,000 for roof repairs after a particularly bad storm season. The money had come with explicit instructions: "Make sure you fix those shingles properly, Claire. I don't want you and Colin dealing with water damage." I'd assumed Colin would call the roofing company we'd gotten estimates from. Instead, he'd deposited the check and told me he'd found a better investment opportunity. "Cryptocurrency is the future, Claire," he'd said over dinner, his eyes bright with the fervor of a convert. "My buddy Jake made $30,000 in 6 months. If we put $4,000 into Bitcoin now, we could double it by Christmas." "But what about the roof? We'll use the profits to fix the roof and still have money left over. It's a win-win." The roof never got fixed that year. The cryptocurrency investment had crashed within 2 months, taking half of Grandpa's gift with it. We'd ended up patching the worst leaks with tarps and prayer, waiting until the following spring when I'd quietly used my bonus money to hire contractors. Grandpa never asked about the roof directly, but I'd caught him looking up at the ceiling during his last visit, his weathered hands tracing water stains that shouldn't have been there. The disappointment in his eyes had cut deeper than any argument. "Claire," Deborah's voice interrupted my spiral of memories. "These documents are quite interesting. Mr. Hendricks, could you explain the section about immediate liquidation rights?" As the attorneys began a tense discussion about legal terminology and fiduciary responsibilities, I found myself remembering the voice memos I'd discovered on Colin's phone just last week. I'd been looking for a restaurant's phone number in his recent calls when I'd accidentally opened his voice memo app. Dozens of recordings dating back months. Colin talking to himself about investment strategies and asset optimization. But the one that had made my blood run cold was from just 3 days after Grandpa's funeral. "Once Claire signs the trust paperwork, I'll have joint control," his voice had whispered into the phone. "Jake thinks we can flip the property within 6 months if we price it right. The old man's antique collection alone should be worth 6 figures. He'd been planning this before Grandpa was even buried. While I'd been grieving, choosing flowers and writing obituary notices, Colin had been calculating profits and plotting how to monetize my inheritance. The realization that I'd been married to a financial predator for 7 years should have devastated me. Instead, standing in that living room surrounded by the evidence of his betrayal, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: clarity. Every argument where he'd made me feel unreasonable for wanting transparency. Every purchase that had appeared without discussion. Every time he'd dismissed my concerns as not understanding finances. Every instance where my success had been reframed as our opportunity. It had all been part of a systematic pattern of control that I'd been too trusting to recognize. But now, with Deborah dismantling his carefully laid trap and Colin's hired attorneys growing increasingly uncomfortable, I finally understood what Grandpa had seen and tried to warn me about. The inheritance hadn't revealed Colin's true nature. It had simply given him a bigger target to aim for. The clarity that had crystallized in my mind over the past few minutes transformed into something far more powerful: strategic focus. While Colin's hired attorneys shuffled through their documents and exchanged increasingly nervous glances, I reached into my leather portfolio, the same one I'd carried to important client presentations for years, and withdrew a manila folder thick with evidence I'd been quietly gathering for the past week. "Deborah," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins, "I think these gentlemen might be interested in reviewing some additional documentation before we proceed." I placed the folder on the coffee table next to their carefully arranged papers, watching as Colin's face went pale. He knew that folder. He'd seen it on my desk at home, had even asked about it casually 2 days ago. I told him it was work stuff, client research. In a way that hadn't been a lie. "What's that?" Robert Hendricks asked, his professional composure slipping slightly as Deborah opened the folder with the deliberate precision of someone who knew exactly what they were looking at. "Evidence," I replied simply, pulling out the first document, a bank statement I'd printed from our joint account. "This shows a pattern of unauthorized transactions spanning the past 3 years. Vacation bookings, luxury car leases, cryptocurrency investments, all made without my knowledge or consent, using funds that were meant for specific purposes." Colin's brother Evan had moved away from the window, his discomfort obvious as he realized he was witnessing something far more serious than a simple inheritance discussion. Sandra had disappeared entirely, probably hiding in her bedroom until this nightmare ended. "Claire, those weren't unauthorized," Colin said quickly, his voice taking on that same persuasive tone he'd used for years to make me doubt my own memories. "We discussed all of those decisions. You were there for every conversation." I pulled out my phone, opening the voice memo app with theatrical timing. "Actually, Colin, that's interesting you mention our conversations. I've been recording some of them lately." The blood drained from his face so quickly I thought he might faint. "You, what?" "Tuesday night," I said, pressing play on the most damning recording. "You were on the phone with Jake while you thought I was asleep." Colin's voice filled the room, tinny but unmistakably clear. "Once she signs it, we'll flip the estate within 6 months. The old man probably has antiques worth more than the house itself. Jake thinks if we move fast, we can liquidate everything before she has time to get sentimental about it." The silence that followed was deafening. James Morrison actually closed his briefcase, clearly calculating whether his fee was worth whatever legal complications were about to unfold. Robert Hendricks cleared his throat nervously, suddenly finding his expensive shoes fascinating. "That's taken out of context," Colin stammered, but his usual confidence had evaporated completely. "I was just hypothetically discussing options. Every financial advisor explores different scenarios." Deborah smiled, the kind of smile that had probably intimidated countless opposing counsel over her decades of practice. "Mr. Reed, are you claiming to be a licensed financial advisor? Because I don't see any credentials listed in your background check." Background check. Colin's voice cracked slightly. Oh yes, Deborah continued smoothly, pulling out a thick document. Claire hired me to conduct a thorough investigation into any potential conflicts of interest regarding this inheritance. Very wise of her, considering what we discovered. I watched Colin's Adam's apple bob as he swallowed hard, realizing that while he'd been plotting against me, I'd been building a case against him. The student had finally surpassed the teacher, except I'd never wanted this particular education. This is harassment, he said weakly, but the fight was already draining out of him. No, I replied, reaching into the folder again. This is transparency. Something you might remember from our wedding vows, the part about honesty and trust. I pulled out the notarized copy of Grandpa's letter, the one that had been burning a hole in my heart since the day I'd received it. I think everyone should hear what my grandfather really thought about this situation. Clearing my throat, I read aloud the section that mattered most. I'm leaving everything to Claire because she's the only one who ever saw past the money. I worry about that husband of hers. I've watched how his eyes light up when he thinks about money, how he steers conversations toward my business ventures and investment strategies. Be careful who you trust with this gift, my dear. The words hung in the air like a judgment from beyond the grave. Colin tried to interrupt, but I continued reading. Claire is the only one I trust to use this inheritance wisely, to build something meaningful rather than simply consume. She has a good heart, but she also has the strength to protect what matters when the time comes. The old man was confused, Colin said desperately, his voice rising. He was on medication, probably didn't know what he was saying. You can't base legal decisions on the ramblings of someone who wasn't thinking clearly. That's when Deborah delivered the knockout punch. She pulled out a medical file, complete with official letterhead and physician signatures. Actually, Mr. Reed, these are your grandfather-in-law's medical records from his final 6 months. Dr. Patricia Williams ran comprehensive cognitive assessments right up until 2 weeks before his death. His mental faculties were not only intact, they were exceptional for a man his age. She flipped to a specific page, reading from the doctor's notes. Patient demonstrates sharp memory, clear reasoning, and excellent judgment. No signs of cognitive decline or medication-related confusion. Recommend continued independent living with no restrictions on legal decision-making. The medical records hit Colin like a physical blow. His last desperate defense, claiming Grandpa wasn't competent, had just crumbled to dust. Robert Hendricks and James Morrison were already packing up their documents, their professional instincts telling them to distance themselves from what was clearly becoming a legal disaster. Gentlemen, Deborah addressed the attorneys with ice-cold professionalism. I trust you understand that any attempt to coerce Mrs. Reed into signing documents transferring inherited assets could constitute fraud, undue influence, and potentially criminal conspiracy. I assume you'll want to withdraw from this matter immediately to avoid any ethical complications with your respective bar associations. They couldn't pack up fast enough. Papers disappeared into briefcases, business cards were quietly pocketed, and within minutes the 2 men who'd arrived ready to help Colin steal my inheritance were making polite excuses about having other appointments. This isn't over, Colin said, but his voice lacked conviction. He was a man watching his carefully constructed plan collapse in real time, realizing that the wife he'd underestimated had outmaneuvered him completely. You're right, I agreed, standing up and gathering my evidence back into the folder. It's not over. But what happens next depends entirely on how honest you're willing to be about what you've already taken from me. For the first time in 7 years of marriage, Colin had no response. No charm, no manipulation, no way to twist the conversation to his advantage. He'd walked into his own trap, and now he was discovering just how much his supposedly naive wife had learned about fighting back. The drive away from Sandra's house felt like emerging from underwater, each mile putting distance between me and 7 years of suffocating manipulation. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had gone white, but for the first time in months, I could breathe deeply without feeling like something was constricting my chest. Luna was waiting for me when I got home, her golden retriever tail wagging frantically as if she could sense the seismic shift that had just occurred in our lives. I buried my face in her soft fur, letting the familiar comfort of her unconditional love wash over me while I tried to process what came next. The house felt different now, not like home but like a museum of lies I'd been living in without realizing it. Every piece of furniture, every picture on the wall, Every shared memory suddenly seemed tainted by the knowledge of what Colin had really been thinking all these years. The granite countertops he'd insisted we needed, the oversized television he'd bought without consulting me, the wine collection he'd started with money I'd thought was going toward retirement savings. All of it felt like evidence of a life I'd been tricked into building. I couldn't stay here. Not tonight, maybe not ever. By Tuesday morning, I'd found a furnished studio apartment on the other side of town. Small, clean, and completely my own. The elderly landlord, Mrs. Chin, didn't ask questions when I paid 6 months upfront in cash and explained I'd need to move in immediately. She just handed me the keys and said, "Sometimes we all need a fresh start, honey." Luna adapted to our new space faster than I did, claiming the sunny spot by the window as her new favorite napping location. Watching her settle in with such simple contentment reminded me that happiness didn't require square footage or granite countertops. It required peace, something I hadn't realized I'd been missing until I found it again. Colin's first text arrived at 6:23 a.m. on Wednesday. "Claire, we need to talk. This is all a huge misunderstanding." I deleted it without responding. The messages kept coming throughout the week, each one a masterclass in manipulation disguised as remorse. "I know I've made mistakes, but we can work through this together. You're throwing away 7 years over money. Is that really what you want? I love you. Doesn't that count for anything?" That last one made me laugh. A bitter, hollow sound that echoed in my small studio. But what Colin felt for me had never been love. It had been ownership, control, the satisfaction of having someone he could mold to serve his purposes. Real love didn't scheme behind closed doors or try to steal from the person you claimed to cherish. Thursday brought flowers to my office. A massive arrangement of white roses that my assistant, Janet, wheeled in with raised eyebrows and barely concealed curiosity. The card read, "I'm sorry. Let me make this right." "Secret admirer?" Janet asked, but I was already dropping the bouquet into the trash can beside my desk. "Something like that," I replied, turning back to my computer screen. The symbolic gesture felt surprisingly liberating. Colin's charm offensive landing exactly where it belonged. Friday's grand gesture was Colin himself, standing in the parking garage as I left work, holding another bouquet and wearing his most contrite expression. He'd clearly been waiting for a while, probably timing his arrival to catch me at my most vulnerable moment after a long day. "Claire, please," he called out as I approached my car. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking." I stopped, studying the man I'd been married to for 7 years. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the knowledge that his mask had finally slipped completely. "What could you possibly say that would make any difference?" "I made mistakes," he said, stepping closer. "But we're married. That has to mean something. We can go to counseling, work through this together. I'll change, I promise." The word, change, almost made me laugh again. "Colin, you tried to steal my inheritance. You brought lawyers to intimidate me into signing away my grandfather's final gift. You've been manipulating our finances for years without my knowledge. This isn't about making mistakes. This is about who you fundamentally are." "But I love you," he said, and for a moment, I almost believed he thought that was true. "No," I replied quietly, unlocking my car door. "You love what I could provide for you. There's a difference." That weekend, I sat in my small studio with divorce papers spread across the tiny dining table, Luna's head resting on my feet as I read through each page carefully. Deborah had been thorough. Every asset protected, every potential claim anticipated. When I reached the section about irreconcilable differences, I paused, pen hovering over the signature line. The tears came then, but not for the reasons I expected. I wasn't crying because my marriage was over. I was crying because it had taken me so long to realize it had never really existed in the first place. What I was mourning wasn't Colin, but the 7 years I'd spent believing in a love that had been performance art from the very beginning. I signed the papers with a steady hand, then called Deborah to schedule filing them first thing Monday morning. The next week, I did something that would have horrified the old me. I used $50,000 of Grandpa's inheritance to establish the Edward Whitmore Home Improvement Grant, specifically designed to help women who needed to make their homes safer or more secure. The irony wasn't lost on me that money Colin had tried to steal would now help other women escape situations like mine. The grant application process was simple. Prove you needed help making your home safer and we'd provide up to $5,000 for security systems, lock changes, repairs, or modifications. No questions asked about why you needed the improvements, no judgment about your circumstances. The first application came from a woman named Sarah, who needed money to install deadbolts and security cameras after leaving an abusive relationship. As I approved her grant, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The satisfaction of using money to create safety instead of having it used to control me. Deborah helped me place the remaining inheritance in an irrevocable trust with me as the sole beneficiary and trustee. This way, she explained, no future partner, spouse, or creditor can touch these assets without your explicit written consent. You learned an expensive lesson about trust. Let's make sure you never have to learn it again. As I signed the trust documents, I thought about Grandpa's letter, about his warning to be careful who I trusted with his gift. He'd known something I'd been too naive to see, and now his money would be protected exactly the way he'd intended. Under my complete control, safe from anyone who might see dollar signs instead of the granddaughter he'd loved unconditionally. For the first time in 7 years, every financial decision in my life was mine alone to make. 6 months after signing the trust documents, I found myself standing in front of Whitmore Hardware on Elm Street, keys heavy in my palm as I stared at the faded, closed sign that had been hanging in the window since Grandpa's stroke 3 years ago. The building looked smaller than I remembered from my childhood visits, but the bones were solid, just like everything Grandpa had built. The smell hit me the moment I unlocked the front door. Sawdust, metal polish, and that indefinable scent of honest work that had clung to Grandpa's clothes every evening when he'd come home to help me with homework. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through grimy windows, and I could almost hear the echo of his voice explaining the difference between Phillips head and flathead screwdrivers to customers who'd become friends over decades of shared projects. It's not about the money, Claire, he told me on my 16th birthday, gesturing around the crowded aisles of tools and hardware. It's about what you build with it. Money sitting in a bank account is just numbers. But money that helps people create something, fix something, improve their lives, that's what matters. Standing in that empty store, I finally understood what he'd been trying to teach me all those years. The renovation took 3 months and a significant portion of my inheritance, but watching the space transform felt like watching a resurrection. Where there had once been shelves of nuts and bolts, we installed workbenches and tool stations. The back room that had stored paint cans became a classroom with whiteboards and projectors. The old cash register counter was replaced with a reception desk where women could sign up for courses in plumbing, electrical work, carpentry, and small engine repair. The Whitmore Women's Vocational Center opened on a crisp October morning with 12 students in our first electrical basics class. I'd expected maybe 6 or 7 women to show up, but word had spread through domestic violence shelters, job placement centers, and community organizations faster than I'd anticipated. Maria was the first to sign up, a soft-spoken mother of 2 who'd left her husband after 20 years of marriage and needed skills that would pay enough to support her children. She'd never held a power tool before, but by the end of the first week, she was wiring light switches with steady hands and growing confidence. I always wanted to learn this stuff, she told me during a coffee break, flexing fingers that were finally free of wedding rings. But he said it wasn't women's work. Said I'd just hurt myself and waste money on tools I'd never use. Her story echoed through our center like a chorus I was learning by heart. There was Jennifer, who discovered her husband had been stealing from their joint account for years to fund gambling debts. Rebecca, whose ex-boyfriend had controlled every aspect of her life, including her career choices. Diana, who'd realized that financial independence meant more than just having a job. It meant having skills that couldn't be taken away. Each woman who walked through our doors carried her own version of the same awakening I'd experienced in Sandra's living room that Sunday afternoon. The realization that trust had been weaponized against them. That love had been confused with control. That they'd been systematically made to doubt their own capabilities and worth. But here, surrounded by the purposeful noise of drill bits and saw blades, something magical happened. Voices that had been silenced began to speak up about project ideas and safety concerns. Hands that had been discouraged from touching anything important learned to measure twice and cut once. Women who'd been told they weren't smart enough to handle finances calculated material costs and labor estimates with growing precision. I found my own strength returning as I watched theirs emerge. Teaching a basic plumbing class to 8 women who'd all been told they were too emotional, or not mechanically inclined, became a weekly reminder that the lies we'd been told about ourselves were just that, lies. The second center opened 18 months later in a converted warehouse across town, this time focusing on automotive repair and small business management. By then, Maria had completed her electrical certification and was working for a local contractor, making twice what she'd ever earned in her previous jobs. Jennifer had started her own handyman service, and Rebecca was 6 months into a community college engineering program. The morning we cut the ribbon on the new facility, I hung Grandpa's portrait in the main workshop, the same photo that had sat on his hardware store counter for 30 years, showing him as a young man with calloused hands and kind eyes. Several reporters had come to cover the expansion, asking questions about funding and community impact and future plans. But when the cameras stopped rolling and the crowd dispersed, I found myself alone in the workshop with his picture, remembering the last conversation we'd had before his stroke. He'd been worried about Colin even then, mentioning that he'd noticed how my husband's eyes never quite met his during family dinners, how Colin always seemed to be calculating something behind his smile. "You've got good instincts, Claire," he'd said, adjusting his old baseball cap the way he did when he was thinking seriously about something. "Don't let anyone convince you to ignore them. And remember, the best inheritance isn't money. It's knowing your own worth." A month later, the email arrived from Colin's attorney, a formal request to revisit the asset division, based on new information regarding the inheritance acquisition. Reading between the legal language, it was clear that Colin had spent the past year looking for any angle to challenge Grandpa's will or claim some portion of what had never belonged to him. I forwarded the email to Deborah with a single-sentence response: "Talk to my lawyer." Her reply came back within an hour: "Already handled. Some people never learn." Standing in the workshop that evening, watching our newest class of students practice welding techniques under the patient guidance of our instructor, I felt a satisfaction deeper than anything I'd experienced during 7 years of marriage. These women weren't learning trades just to earn money. They were reclaiming pieces of themselves that had been systematically stolen. As I locked up the center and headed home to my small apartment where Luna waited with her usual enthusiastic greeting, I paused to look back at the building that bore Grandpa's name. The windows glowed with warm light, tools hung in organized rows, and tomorrow would bring new students ready to discover what they were truly capable of building. "You were right," I whispered to his memory, carried on the evening breeze. "I did make it matter." The inheritance had given me financial freedom, but the legacy I was choosing to live by, that was something no one could ever take away. If this story of justice and empowerment had you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Claire smiled and said, "Funny, I brought someone too," completely turning the tables on Colin's scheme. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more inspiring stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.